My wife wanted Christmas to look grown up, like proof that our past could sit at the same table without leaving a mark. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon. The tree was still half finished, and my 16-year-old daughter stayed upstairs, like she could sense the weather changing. Then the doorbell rang, and Tyler Grant stepped into my entryway, holding a pie like a peace offering, smiling like he belonged there. Jenna smiled back too quickly, too practiced the way people smile when they need something to be true. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody crossed a line with words. That was the trap. The lines were in the small things who Jenna looked at first. How Tyler told stories like he still had a claim on our memories, how my silence kept getting mistaken for approval. My name is Mark, and for years I thought being a good man meant staying calm, staying flexible, staying fine. Tyler even praised us for doing it the right way, like my discomfort was just the price of maturity. I felt my daughter watching, learning what a man accepts when he wants peace more than truth. So I set my fork down, stood up, and said, I was stepping outside for a minute. No speech, no argument, just the sound of my chair against the floor and the sudden panic in a room that had been counting on me to play my part. If you think I left because I was jealous, you do not know me. I left because something in me finally stopped cooperating, and it started weeks earlier with the first snow of December drifting down on our quiet street in Westerville, Ohio. The first snow of December fell without asking permission. It drifted down slow and steady, softening the edges of everything it touched. The roofs along our street in Westerville, Ohio turned white one by one, and the cul-de-sac grew quieter. In that way winter always does, like the world was holding its breath. Inside our house, the air smelled of pine and cinnamon. Jenna had hung a fresh wreath on the front door that morning, real branches, not plastic. A candle burned low on the kitchen counter. The Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, already lit, but still bare. Just white lights, no ornaments yet. It looked unfinished, like we were waiting for the right moment to decide what kind of holiday this was going to be. I had just come back from the hardware store. Salt for the driveway. A new latch for the side gate that never closed right. Small, practical errands. The kind that give you something solid to do when the rest of your life feels abstract. I set the bags down by the door and shrugged off my coat. Snow slid onto the mat. Jenna sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a yellow legal pad beside it. Her hair was pulled back. Reading glasses perched low on her nose. She tapped her pen against the paper once in a while, focused, organized, already 3 steps ahead of the day. Upstairs, Rachel's music played softly through the ceiling. A steady rhythm, not loud enough to complain about. She is 16 now, and lately she moves through the house like someone renting a room. Present, polite, and mostly elsewhere. I asked Jenna if she needed help with anything. She did not look up right away. She scrolled, nodded to herself, then spoke in the same tone she might use to remind me we were low on milk. Tyler is coming to Christmas dinner. For a moment I stayed exactly where I was, receipt still folded in my hand, fingers half numb from the cold. The sentence took a second to register, like my brain had to check it against reality before letting it through. Tyler Grant was not a hypothetical. He was not an old friend or a distant relative. He was her ex-husband, the father of her son. A man I had met a handful of times over the years, always briefly, always in neutral places. Parking lots, school events, polite conversations that never quite settled into comfort. I waited for Jenna to add something else, some explanation that would reshape the sentence into something reasonable. She did not. When I looked at her, she finally raised her eyes. Calm, expectant, almost relieved, like she had just checked off a difficult item on a list. I asked her why. I kept my voice even, though I could feel a response rising in me that I was not ready to name. She leaned back in her chair and set the pen down. Her tone shifted into the careful, reasonable cadence she uses when she believes she is being fair. "It is just dinner, Mark. He is in town for a few days. And it is Christmas." I did not answer. Not because I agreed. Not because I was trying to be patient. My mind had simply stepped back, watching the scene unfold as if it belonged to someone else. Jenna kept talking. She always does when silence makes her uneasy. She talked about being adults, about how people co-parent all the time after divorce, about how her son wanted things to feel normal even if he was only flying in for a short visit. She mentioned that Tyler had been doing better lately. Steady job, less drama, trying to show up. Then she said the part that lodged itself in my chest. "You will be fine. You are not the jealous type." She said it gently, almost kindly, as if she were describing a strength. Something tightened in me, not because I felt jealous, but because she had already decided who I was going to be in this moment. She had already written my response for me. The calm one, the understanding one, the man who smiles and swallows discomfort, because that is what mature people do. I walked to the sink and rinsed my hands. The water ran warm and steady, grounding in a way I needed more than I expected. Jenna's voice continued behind me, explaining, justifying, smoothing the edges of something sharp. I asked her if she was telling me because she wanted my opinion, or because she wanted me to know what was already decided. There was a pause. Short, but real. She frowned slightly, not angry, more surprised that I would frame it that way. "Mark, it is not about permission. It is about family. It is one meal. Rachel will be upstairs most of the time anyway." I turned off the faucet and looked out the window above the sink. The streetlights were flickering on outside, casting a yellow glow over the fresh snow. Across the street, a blow-up Santa leaned a little to one side, caught mid-wave like he was tired of pretending to be cheerful. "So you already invited him?" She nodded. No hesitation. No guilt. Just a quiet certainty. "Yes." I told him 6. He said he would bring a pie. A pie. The word almost made me laugh, but it never reached my mouth. The normalcy of it all made my stomach twist. The image of her ex-husband walking into my house holding a pie like this was his place too. I asked where she planned to seat him. She blinked clearly, not having considered the question. At the table. Where else? There it was. A thin line drawn without asking me where I stood. I felt something rise in my throat. A response. A sentence, maybe 2. I could have argued. I could have raised my voice. I could have told her this crossed a line. I knew she was braced for that, ready to meet it with logic and reassurance until the moment passed. Instead, I felt my jaw tighten. My hand curled slightly, then relaxed. I swallowed the words before they could turn into something familiar. I looked at Jenna and tried to see her the way I used to. The woman who laughed when I mispronounced fancy cheeses at the grocery store. The woman who held my hand in a hospital waiting room when my father went in for surgery. The woman I married in 2018 because we both believed second chances only worked if you treated them carefully. She was still here. But she was standing on the other side of something she did not even recognize as a boundary. I told her I needed to check something in the garage. She said okay, without really hearing me already, back to her list, planning a holiday that now felt like a project I was no longer part of. The garage was colder, the air heavy with the smell of oil and cardboard. boxes still stacked from when we moved in years ago. My old Ford pickup sat in its usual spot under the light scratched, dull, reliable. It had been with me longer than this marriage. It never asked me to pretend. I stood beside it with my hands in my pockets and listened. The furnace hummed. Rachel's music drifted down from upstairs. Somewhere inside the house, Jenna's pen tapped against the table as she kept organizing our lives. I thought about all the times I had chosen peace over honesty. All the small moments I told myself did not matter because I wanted this home to feel stable. And standing there alone with the quiet, I felt something shift. Not anger, not resolve, just a clear, unsettling sense that the way I had been responding was coming to an end. I did not know yet what I was going to do, but I knew I could not keep being quiet just to make other people comfortable. The quiet did not leave me after that night. It followed me into the next morning and settled in like something permanent. I moved through the house on habit alone, pouring coffee, tying my boots, nodding when Jenna spoke. She acted normal, efficient, already absorbed in plans and schedules. It was not that she was pretending nothing had happened. It was that to her, nothing had. That was when the memories started lining up one after another, asking to be acknowledged. I met Jenna in the fall of 2017 at a charity 5K on the edge of Columbus. My sister had pushed me to sign up, said I needed to get out of my own head after my divorce. Jenna was volunteering near the registration tent, handing out water bottles and safety pins with a practiced smile. She wore a navy hoodie with her company logo stitched on the chest, and spoke like someone used to being calm for a living. We talked about the weather first, then traffic, then how absurd it felt to pay good money just to run in circles. There was no spark that knocked me off balance, just an ease I had not felt in a long time. Over coffee a week later, she told me about her divorce. 2 years behind her, she said carefully. I told her mine was 3. We both spoke like people handling fragile glass. She mentioned her son Owen, 15 at the time, smart, sarcastic, already testing his limits. She mentioned his father Tyler, who lived in Indiana now, close enough to visit, far enough to disappear when things got hard. She did not speak badly about him. That impressed me. I remember thinking this was what maturity looked like. No bitterness, no scorekeeping. The first time I met Tyler was outside a movie theater in Hilliard. Owen was inside with friends. Jenna and I were waiting in the parking lot because Tyler wanted to drop something off. A jacket, maybe. Tyler pulled up in a dark SUV and stepped out smiling like we were colleagues instead of strangers. He shook my hand firmly and held eye contact just long enough to make a point. Good to meet you, Mark. Jenna says you are solid. He said it like a compliment, but it landed like a label. Something sturdy. Something expected not to move. Jenna thanked me afterward for being cool. Owen needs it to be smooth, she said. I nodded. At the time it felt reasonable. That word followed us everywhere. When Jenna and I married in 2018, we promised each other clarity. No games, no lingering attachments. I believed we were doing it right. But life has a way of testing promises in pieces, not all at once. It started with small things. Tyler would text about school schedules or money for sports. Jenna would step into the hallway to take the calls. She came back tired, rubbing her temples, saying he still knew how to push her buttons. I listened. I stayed out of it. Then came the first request. Owen's 16th birthday party was at our house. Pizza boxes on the counter, balloons tied to chairs. Jenna asked if Tyler could stop by to drop off a gift. Just for a minute, she said. Owen would notice if it felt awkward. My instinct was to say no. Not because I felt threatened, but because I wanted our home to be ours. But Jenna looked at me the way she does when she thinks the right answer is obvious. So I said, okay. Tyler stayed longer than planned. He grabbed a beer from the fridge without asking, told stories that made Owen laugh. Before leaving, he clapped my shoulder and said I was doing a good thing. I smiled and told myself it did not matter. Graduation day in 2020 was another one. We sat in the bleachers under the sun. When Tyler arrived late, he slid into the seat beside Jenna without hesitation. She shifted her knees to make space instead of asking him to move. Afterward, she suggested a photo of all of us together for Owen. Tyler's arm rested against her back for the picture. Just a moment. Just long enough. I remember Jenna laughing nervously afterward and saying, "See, this is healthy." She said it quickly like she was convincing herself. There were lunches before Owen left for college. Holidays where Tyler dropped by unannounced. Each time Jenna asked in that same tone, "Just this once. It is for Owen. Let us not make it weird." Each time I agreed. I told myself I was choosing peace. I told myself this was what being a grown man looked like. I did not notice how often the decision was made for me before I was asked. One night after Tyler left early from a visit, Jenna caught me standing alone in the kitchen. She said, "You are not upset, are you?" The question came fast, defensive. When I hesitated, she looked away and started wiping the counter harder than necessary. "I am not choosing him over you," she said. "I just do not want tension." I told her I understood, and she relaxed immediately. That was the pattern. My understanding made things easier. For everyone but me. A week after she mentioned Christmas dinner, I drove out to Plain City to see my dad. He lives in a small ranch house with a workshop out back. Retired now. Quiet. Observant. The kind of man who does not waste words. We sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee from chipped mugs. I talked. He listened. When I told him about Jenna inviting Tyler, he did not react right away. He stared into his cup, then looked up. "Are you living in a marriage, or are you just helping other people feel comfortable?" The question hit harder than any argument could have. I felt heat behind my eyes and swallowed it down. Dad did not press. He never does. He let the silence do the work. On the drive home, his words stayed with me. They filled the cab of my truck like something heavy and unavoidable. That night, I stood in the garage again, staring at the same boxes, the same walls, the same life I had been maintaining instead of choosing. My phone buzzed. A text from Jenna. Tyler confirmed. He is bringing pie. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. Inside the house, I could hear cabinets opening and closing, the soft clink of dishes being rearranged. Rachel laughed upstairs at something on her laptop. For the first time, I did not feel confused about what was happening. I felt clear, and that clarity came with a question I could no longer avoid. Not whether this was normal, but whether I was finally ready to stop letting normal decide for me. That thought followed me into the work week and refused to stay in the background. I packed my bag before dawn and drove to the airport while the sky was still dark, the radio low, the road mostly empty. Fort Collins had been my assignment for months now, overseeing a stretch of infrastructure upgrades that were already under pressure. Normally, work steadied me. It gave my days a shape. This time it felt like I was carrying something loose inside my chest, something that would not settle. The plane climbed through a ceiling of gray, and I stared out the window without really seeing the clouds. My mind kept circling the same idea, how easily silence turns into expectation. How quickly people assume you are fine when you stop saying otherwise. At the site, the air was sharp with cold, and the smell of concrete dust. Crews moved with the same rhythm they always did, boots crunching on gravel radios, crackling with updates. I walked the perimeter with my clipboard nodding, asking questions, doing all the things I had done 100 times before. But the details slipped. A delivery time I misread. A safety note I forgot to pass along. Small mistakes, but they were not like me. Brian Cole noticed. Brian was my regional director, a few years younger than me, sharp without being flashy. He had a way of watching without making it obvious. We stood off to the side while a foreman explained another delay. Brian listened, hands in his jacket pockets, then glanced at me. "You good, Mark?" It was not an accusation, just a check-in. I said I was fine. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on me a second longer than usual. "You have been quieter lately," he said, as we walked back toward the trailers. "Not a problem. Just different." Different. The word landed heavier than it should have. I shrugged it off, told him it was just travel fatigue. He did not push. That almost made it worse. That night in the hotel room, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while the heater clicked on and off. Nothing had gone wrong enough to justify how unsettled I felt. But silence has a way of draining energy from places you do not expect. It makes you work harder just to appear the same. When I flew home a few days later, the house felt busy in a way that left no room for questions. Jenna had lists spread across the counter, notes about dishes, timing, who would arrive when. She talked through it all like she was narrating a plan she had already rehearsed. She mentioned Tyler casually, where he would park, what time he would come, that he preferred pecan pie but she thought apple would be safer. She said it like she was managing a guest with allergies, not her ex-husband. She did not ask how I felt. She did not pause. My silence had done that work for her. Rachel passed through the kitchen with her earbuds and hoodie pulled tight. She grabbed a drink from the fridge and nodded at us both before heading back upstairs. Jenna smiled after her, then turned back to me. "I told Tyler 6 still works," she said. "Traffic should not be bad." I nodded without thinking. The movement felt rehearsed, like my body had learned a script my mind had not approved. Later that evening, I sat on the couch with the news playing quietly. Jenna stepped into the kitchen to take a call. I recognized the tone before I heard the name. Light. Familiar. The kind of voice you use when you know someone will understand the joke without explanation. I did not mean to listen. The walls in our house make that decision for you. She laughed at something he said. Not flirtatious. Comfortable. She said she wanted the evening to feel smooth, that it mattered to her. She mentioned where he could put his coat. She mentioned the pie again. There was no secrecy, no hesitation. Just confidence. Something shifted in me then. I realized my silence had not just been noticed. It had been translated. It meant approval. It meant support. It meant she believed I was on board. When Jenna came back into the living room, she caught the look on my face. For a split second, her smile faltered. "You okay?" she asked a little too quickly. The question sounded defensive, like she was bracing for something. I told her I was tired. She relaxed immediately, reached out and squeezed my arm, then said she would finish up and head to bed. The tension dissolved as soon as I gave her the answer she needed. As she walked away, she added one more thing almost offhand. Tyler said he might bring ice cream too, but I told him the freezer is already full. She said it fast, then laughed lightly, as if the joke was meant to soften the moment. I did not laugh back. She did not notice. I sat there long after the TV went dark, replaying the call in my head. Not the words, but the ease. The way my absence from the conversation had made space for something else. Later, I stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched Rachel move between rooms, phone in hand, laughter bubbling out of her at something on a screen. She glanced down at me and smiled the kind of smile kids give when they sense a shift, but do not yet know what it means. I wondered what she was learning from all of this. What it taught her about staying quiet to keep things smooth. What it taught her about her place in a room. The next morning, I left before Jenna woke up. I took the long way to the office, passing streets lined with houses like ours, neat and unremarkable, each one holding its own set of unspoken agreements. Brian's words echoed in my head. My dad's question followed close behind. At my desk, my phone buzzed. Another message from Jenna. Tyler is all set. He asked if he should bring anything else. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Around me, the office hummed with routine. Keyboards clicked. Printers whirred. People moved on with their days. I set the phone face down and rested my hands on the desk. For the first time, it was clear that saying nothing was no longer neutral. It was shaping expectations, teaching people what I would accept. And beneath that clarity, something unresolved pressed forward. Not anger, not a plan. Just the uneasy knowledge that a moment was coming when silence would no longer be an option, and I still did not know what my voice would sound like when I finally used it. That uneasy awareness stayed with me as the week slid toward Christmas. It did not announce itself. It just lingered, surfacing in the quiet seconds between tasks, between conversations, when there was nothing left to distract me. I noticed it most around Rachel, because she had started watching more closely. Saturday morning, she was at the kitchen counter working on a school project. Poster board markers, her laptop open to a half-finished slide deck. One earbud in the other hanging loose. I poured coffee and leaned against the counter the way I always did when I wanted to feel normal. "You working today?" she asked without looking up. I told her I was home. She nodded, then glanced at me again, quick and careful. "Mom says Christmas dinner is going to be bigger this year." "Probably," I said. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. "That okay with you?" It was a simple question, but it landed heavier than she could have known. Not because I did not have an answer, but because I realized she was already paying attention. She could feel the shift even if she did not know its cause. "We will see," I said. She went back to her project, but her shoulders stayed tight, like she was waiting for something else to follow. Later that afternoon, I was outside shoveling the driveway when Tom from next door wandered over. He's a few years older than me and retired early, spends his time fixing motorcycles and commenting on the weather like it is a personal challenge. He leaned on his shovel and watched me work. "Jenna mentioned you all are doing the blended family thing for Christmas," he said. "That takes some maturity." I stopped shoveling and caught my breath. He meant it as praise. "Times are different now," he added. "You know how it is. Got to be open-minded." Though he hesitated, then shrugged. "Guess it is not easy for everyone." That last part came out softer, almost like an afterthought. It was the first crack I had heard in the chorus of approval. I nodded, unsure whether to respond, and went back to clearing the snow. At the grocery store later, I ran into a couple from the neighborhood. We talked about weather and travel plans. Jenna answered most of the questions, her voice light and efficient. When she mentioned Tyler would be joining us for dinner, the woman smiled wide. "That is really healthy," she said. "You guys are doing it right." Her husband nodded, then added as if trying to soften it well, "As long as everybody is comfortable." Comfortable. The word hung there, vague enough to mean whatever anyone needed it to mean. That night after dinner, Rachel asked if I could help her study. We sat at the table with her notes spread between us. She chewed on the end of her pen, frustrated. I do not get why teachers always say to speak up if something feels wrong, she said, then act annoyed when you actually do. I asked her what happened. She told me about a group project. One kid kept talking over her. She did not want to cause drama, so she stayed quiet until it started bothering her every day. When she finally said something, the teacher told her to be more flexible. That does not seem fair, she said quietly. I looked at her and felt the ground shift under my feet. This was no longer theoretical. I told her people sometimes confuse keeping things smooth with doing what is right. That being flexible does not mean ignoring your own limits. She frowned, considering it. So how do you know when to say something? I hesitated. The truth was, I was still figuring that out myself. I told her if something keeps bothering you, if it does not go away when you try to let it go, that is usually a sign. And that saying no does not make you difficult. It just means you are paying attention. She nodded slowly, like she was filing it away. What if people get mad? Sometimes they will, I said. That does not automatically mean you are wrong. She studied me for a moment, then asked the question I had not been ready for. Is that what you are doing with Mom? The room went quiet in a way that felt intentional. I did not answer right away. Not because I was angry, but because I realized how closely she had been watching me, how much she was learning from what I chose to absorb without comment. I told her grown-ups struggle with the same things kids do. We just hide it better. I said I was thinking about some things, and that was okay. She seemed to accept that, or maybe she sensed how close she had come to something was not ready to unpack. She gathered her papers and headed upstairs. I stayed at the table long after the house went quiet, replaying the day. Tom's half-finished thought. The neighbor's smile. The praise for being reasonable. All of it pressed against the same question. At what point does being mature turn into erasing yourself? Later, Jenna sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She mentioned a few last details about Christmas, then noticed I was not responding. You have been pretty quiet lately, she said, trying to sound casual. Everything okay? I almost said yes. The word was right there, ready, familiar. Instead, I said I was thinking. She nodded, satisfied enough, and went back to her screen. The moment passed. When I went to bed, sleep did not come easily. I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of the choice in front of me. Not a confrontation. Not yet. Something smaller, but harder. I did not need to prove a point. I did not need to make anyone uncomfortable on purpose. But I needed perspective. I needed to talk to someone who would not tell me to be flexible or mature or open-minded. Someone who would help me see whether I was drawing a line too late or finally drawing one at all. And beneath that decision, another thought lingered, quieter, but just as persistent. What if I was wrong? What if speaking up cost me more than staying silent ever had? I lay there with that question unanswered, knowing only that pretending it did not exist was no longer an option. That question stayed with me through the night, quiet but persistent. By morning, I knew thinking alone was not going to move me forward. I did not need reassurance. I needed perspective that did not come wrapped in slogans. I called Michael Turner before work. We had known each other since our early 30s, back when life felt simpler and mistakes felt reversible. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar. You sound like a man who finally decided to stop circling the block, he said. Come by this afternoon. We met at a small coffee shop near the courthouse downtown. The kind of place where people speak softly and leave without drawing attention. Michael stood when he saw me, shook my hand, then studied my face longer than politeness required. You look worn out, he said. Sit. He ordered coffee without asking what I wanted. Same as always. He remembered things like that. It was one of the reasons people trusted him with hard truths. He did not ask what brought me there right away. We talked about work, about my dad, about how quickly the year had slipped by. Only when the noise of the room settled did he lean back and wait. I told him about Christmas dinner, about Jenna, about Tyler, about the way everything had been decided before I realized I had a say. I did not raise my voice. I did not exaggerate. I just laid it out. Michael listened, elbows on the table, fingers wrapped around his cup. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and shook his head slightly. "You are not here because you want to burn things down," he said. "If you were, you would be louder." I told him I did not want revenge. I did not want to punish anyone. I just wanted to stop feeling like I was fading out of my own life. "That is fair," he said. "Most people think lawyers are about winning. We are really about consequences." He paused, then added with a half smile, "And most people do not actually want justice. They want relief." We talked about real things, not dramatic hypotheticals. He asked about the house, about whose name was on the mortgage, about how long Jenna and I had been married, about Rachel, about what stability actually meant if it only existed on the surface. "Every choice costs something," he said. "Time, money, reputation, emotional energy. None of it is free. The problem is people make choices without counting the price." He did not tell me what to do. He did not suggest filing paperwork or drawing lines in the sand. In fact, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Legal tools are not weapons," he said. "They are guardrails. They exist so you do not lose control when emotions run high. But they are useless if you are afraid to choose a direction." I told him part of me worried I was overreacting, that maybe this was just pride, not principle. Michael rubbed his face with one hand and sighed the first crack in his calm. "Pride is loud," he said. "What you are describing sounds more like exhaustion. And exhaustion is what happens when you keep paying for something you never agreed to buy." He asked me to imagine doing nothing, letting Christmas happen as planned, letting the pattern continue. I pictured the table, Tyler's chair, Jenna moving easily between conversations, Rachel watching everything, absorbing more than anyone realized. I felt my chest tighten. Michael saw it. "Silence is still a decision," he said. "It just tells everyone else that your comfort is optional." I asked him what the strongest response was, not the angriest, not the most dramatic. He thought for a moment, eyes on the window. "The strongest move is often withdrawing what people assumed they were entitled to," he said. "Your presence, your participation, not as punishment, just as truth." That idea stayed with me. Not confrontation, not revenge, just stepping out of a role I had been assigned without consent. As we stood to leave, Michael put a hand on my shoulder. "Whatever you decide," he said, "make sure it is something you can live with 5 years from now. Not something that just feels good today." I drove home slower than usual. His words did not feel like instructions. They felt like permission to stop pretending. When I walked in, Jenna was on the phone. I heard Tyler's name, timing, logistics, the same calm planning tone. I set my keys down quietly and listened longer than I meant to. Nothing sounded wrong. That was the problem. When she ended the call, she smiled at me, easy and familiar. "Hey, everything okay?" The old answer rose up automatically. "Yes, I am fine. Do not worry." I let it pass. I told her I needed some time to think about Christmas dinner. The words came out steady without heat. Her smile faltered. What do you mean? I told her I was not sure I would be there if things stayed the same. The room went still. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she did not have a plan ready. She asked if I was serious. I said yes, calmly. I did not argue. I did not explain further. I told her we could talk later. Then I went upstairs and closed the door. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I felt something I had not expected. Not relief, not triumph, apprehension. I thought about Rachel, about how this choice might ripple through the house, about the possibility that setting a boundary would cost me more than staying quiet ever had. But beneath that fear was something steadier. I was done being the man who was always fine. Whatever came next would have consequences. I could feel them gathering already, and for the first time I was choosing to face them instead of pretending they were not there. I could feel them gathering already in the days that followed the consequences, the subtle shifts. Jenna walked around me carefully, not apologizing, not backing down either. She acted like we were both waiting for the other person to blink. When she spoke about Christmas, her voice stayed polite, practical. The same words, just delivered with more caution. Rachel noticed. She always did. On Christmas Eve, she asked if we were still doing dinner. I told her yes. She did not ask who was coming. She just nodded and went upstairs, but I could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders like she was bracing for weather. Christmas Day arranged bright and cold, the kind of cold that makes the air look clean. I shoveled the walkway in silence while Jenna worked in the kitchen, the smell of roasting meat and buttered rolls drifting through the house. Holiday music played softly from a speaker cheerful enough to feel like a lie. By late afternoon, the living room looked ready for company. Candles on the mantel, plates set out on the dining table. The tree still mostly undecorated except for lights and a few ornaments Rachel had hung half-heartedly. Everything looked right. That was the problem. Jenna moved with purpose, but her hands gave her away. She checked the oven twice in 5 minutes, adjusted the napkins, then adjusted them again. When she glanced at me, her eyes held that cautious question she would not speak aloud. I stayed steady, not distant, not cold, just present in a way that belonged to me, not to the situation. Around 5:45, a car door shut outside. Jenna's head lifted immediately. Rachel paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The doorbell rang. Jenna wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the entryway. I followed at a slower pace. Not to supervise, just because it was my house. When she opened the door, Tyler stood there with a pie carrier in one hand and a bag in the other. He looked the same as always. Well-dressed in a dark coat, hair neatly trimmed, smile practiced. He stepped forward like he had rehearsed it. "Merry Christmas," he said, cheerful, confident, like he belonged. Jenna smiled back. Too quickly. Too wide. Tyler leaned in for a brief hug, polite on the surface, familiar in the way it lingered. Then his eyes found mine. He held the pie up slightly. "Apple," he said, like we had planned it together. I nodded once. "Come on in," Jenna said. She stepped aside. Tyler entered, took his shoes off without being asked, then looked around like he was taking inventory of what had changed since the last time he was here. His gaze landed on the tree, the bare branches lit up, and he chuckled. "Still not finished, huh?" Jenna laughed lightly the way she does when she wants something to sound normal. "We have been busy," she said. Rachel came down the stairs slowly, hoodie on, hair pulled back. Tyler turned his smile toward her like a spotlight. "Hey, kiddo," he said, even though Rachel was not his kid. He said it anyway, casual, friendly, like he was extending his reach. Rachel gave a small nod. She glanced at me, then looked away. Dinner itself was exactly what Jenna had promised. Civil, polite, no raised voices, no direct insults. Nobody crossed a line with words. Tyler complimented the food, asked Rachel about school, as if he had a right to ask. Jenna answered some of the questions for her, smoothing the conversation along. I spoke when I needed to. Short sentences, neutral tone, the kind of responses that keep a table moving. From the outside, it might have looked like a success, but tension does not always announce itself. Sometimes it lives in the small choices, the order of attention, the way a laugh comes easier for one person than another, the way someone leans toward a familiar voice without noticing they are doing it. Tyler told a story about Owen, Jenna's son, about a time he got lost at a county fair when he was little. Jenna laughed first, then told the rest of the story for him, as if they were co-hosting a memory. I watched Rachel's face tighten just slightly, like she was watching a scene she did not want to be in. Tyler looked at Jenna when he spoke. Not always, but often. And when he made a joke, he waited for her reaction first, like it mattered most. Jenna kept trying to keep everything smooth. She asked me if I wanted more potatoes, asked Tyler if he wanted more gravy, asked Rachel if she was okay. The questions came one after another, like she was managing a delicate operation. At one point, Tyler glanced at me and said, "You know you guys are doing this the right way. A lot of people can't." He said it as if it were praise, as if my willingness to sit there made me enlightened. I felt something in my chest, not anger exactly, more like clarity, the kind that arrives when you stop hoping someone will understand and accept that they do not need to. Rachel pushed her food around her plate. Jenna noticed and asked if she was full. Rachel said she was just tired. Tyler smiled and said teenagers are always tired. Jenna laughed again, a little strained, and reached for her water. I watched Jenna's hands. They were steady, but her fingers kept tapping the side of her glass. A small betrayal of nerves. Then Tyler asked Jenna about work. She told him about a situation with a difficult employee, something that could have waited for any other day. Tyler listened closely, offered an opinion, nodded like he knew the right answers. Jenna nodded back. Their voices fell into a rhythm I had heard before, even if I tried not to. I realized something then. This dinner was not about Owen. It was not even about Christmas. It was about Jenna proving a version of herself, the mature one, the reasonable one, the woman who could invite her past into the present and call it growth. And my role in that story was to sit quietly and make it true. The room felt warm from the oven and the bodies around the table, but I felt cold inside. Not in a dramatic way, in a simple way, like a light had gone out. I set my fork down. Not hard, just down. Jenna looked at me immediately. Tyler kept talking, then noticed the shift when the table went quieter. I stood up. Jenna's eyes widened a fraction. Rachel froze her gaze, flicking to me like she was afraid to move. I said in the same calm voice I used when I told Jenna I needed time to think, "I'm going to step outside for a minute. I'll be back later." No explanation, no accusation, no speech. Tyler blinked as if he had not understood. Jenna started to speak, then stopped. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She did not know what script to use for this part. Rachel watched me like she was watching a door open for the first time. I walked away from the table, through the living room, past the lit tree and out the front door. The cold hit my face immediately sharp and clean. Snow creaked under my shoes as I stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens on holidays. A few houses glowed with warm light. Somewhere down the street, someone's wind chimes moved softly in the breeze. I took a long breath and let it out. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight in my chest loosen, not because the situation was solved, but because I had stopped pretending it was fine. Behind the door, I could hear muffled voices. Jenna's tighter now. Tyler's lower, more controlled. I stayed where I was, looking out at the snow, realizing that the hardest part was done. Now I just had to live with what I had started. The house did not explode after that night. It did something quieter. It shifted. Christmas morning came and went without ceremony. Jenna moved through the kitchen like she was walking through unfamiliar space, careful with every step. She did not bring up the dinner. She did not apologize either. She acted as if we were both waiting for the other to explain what had happened, and neither of us was willing to start. Tyler did not come back. There were no follow-up texts about leftovers or jokes about the cold. Whatever confidence he had carried into the house the night before had stayed there. Without my presence at the table, the shape of things had changed in a way he had not planned for. Rachel noticed everything. She did not ask questions. She watched instead. When I made coffee in the morning, she lingered nearby longer than usual. When Jenna spoke to me, Rachel looked up from her phone, listening to the tone as much as the words. That afternoon, Rachel asked if I wanted to take a walk with her, just around the block. The sky was pale, and the snow had started to melt into patches of brown. We walked side by side, hands in our pockets, the way we used to when she was younger, and needed help talking through things she could not name yet. She did not mention dinner. She did not mention Tyler. I am glad you came back inside last night, she said after a while. I nodded. But I am also glad you left. I stopped walking and looked at her. She shrugged slightly, like she was not sure how much she was allowed to say. It felt honest, she said. I did not respond right away. There was nothing to correct. At work, something unexpected happened. My focus returned. Not all at once, but steadily, like a fog lifting. I caught details again. Corrected a timeline before it became a problem. Brian noticed. Good to have you back, he said one afternoon, not unkindly. I realized then how much energy I had been spending managing a silence that was never mine to maintain. The real conversation with Jenna came 2 days later. Not during an argument. Not late at night. It happened on a Tuesday evening while the dishwasher hummed in the background and the house felt neutral again. She stood at the counter folding a dish towel, then refolding it, then setting it down. She did not look at me when she spoke. I keep replaying dinner, she said. I did not expect you to leave. I told her I had said I might not stay. She nodded. I know. I just did not think you meant it. There it was. Not accusation. Realization. I waited. I had learned not to fill silence just because it was uncomfortable. She turned toward me finally. Her voice was steadier than I expected. You embarrassed me, she said, then stopped herself. No. That is not it. You surprised me. I asked her what she thought I would do. She hesitated, then answered honestly. I thought you would handle it. Like you always do. The words landed without cruelty. That made them harder to ignore. I told her I had been handling things for a long time. That leaving the table was not about Tyler. It was about me realizing I was disappearing in my own home. She crossed her arms, then let them fall again. She looked tired. I was trying to do the right thing, she said. I thought being open meant being fair. I told her openness without boundaries is not fairness. It is just confusion dressed up as maturity. She frowned, not defensive this time. Thinking. I did not accuse her of choosing Tyler. I did not bring up the past point by point. I told her something simpler. I said I could not keep being the man who absorbs discomfort, so everything else can stay smooth. That if things were going to move forward, my presence could not be assumed anymore. It had to be chosen. She asked what that meant. I told her it meant I would no longer share space with Tyler in our home. Not as a punishment, not as leverage, just as a boundary. Her breath caught slightly. What about Owen? She asked. I told her Owen was an adult now, that relationships change, that co-parenting does not require shared holidays under one roof forever. She was quiet for a long time. I did not expect this to cost so much, she said finally. I told her the cost had been there all along. It had just not been visible while I was paying it alone. She did not argue. She did not agree either. But something in her expression shifted. Not acceptance. Recognition. That night, she did not reach for her phone. She sat beside me on the couch and stared at the dark TV screen. I did not know what this meant for us, she said. Neither did I. But I knew what it meant for me. The next day, Tyler sent a text, short, polite, asking if everything was okay. I did not respond. Jenna saw the message later and looked at me waiting. I told her I was not interested in reopening a conversation that only existed because my silence had once made it possible. She nodded slowly. In the days that followed, things did not snap back into place. They rearranged themselves. Jenna spoke more carefully. Rachel seemed lighter. The house felt less smooth, but more honest. One evening, standing alone in the kitchen, I realized something important. Nothing had been fixed, but something had been reset. The version of me that stayed quiet to keep peace was gone. The role I had played without consent was no longer available. Whatever came next would have to meet me where I stood now. And that place was not where I had been before. The weeks after Christmas did not resolve themselves into anything neat. They unfolded slowly, unevenly, like a road after winter, where the ice has melted, but the cracks remain. Some days felt lighter. Others carried a quiet weight that surprised me when I least expected it. Jenna and I learned a new rhythm, careful, deliberate. We talked about practical things and left the harder subjects alone unless one of us was ready. There were moments when I caught her studying me not with anger, but with something closer to recalibration, as if she was measuring where I stood now and realizing the old map no longer worked. There were also moments when doubt crept in on me. Late at night, lying awake, I wondered if I had pushed too far, if I had mistaken resolve for righteousness, if silence might have been easier after all. Those thoughts came quietly without drama, and I let them pass instead of wrestling them to the ground. Growth does not always feel strong. Sometimes it just feels exposed. Rachel noticed everything, but she carried it differently now. She laughed more. She asked questions that were not cautious. One evening while I was making dinner, she leaned against the counter and watched me work. "Mom seems different," she said. I asked her how. "Like she is thinking more before she talks," she said. "Like she knows things can change." I nodded. That felt accurate. Later that night, as we loaded the dishwasher together, Rachel paused with a plate in her hands. "I did not know you could do that," she said again. "Leave the room like that." I told her most people think leaving means giving up. Sometimes it just means choosing not to disappear. She smiled, small and thoughtful, and went upstairs without another word. I stood there for a moment, feeling the quiet settle in a way that did not scare me. Work continued to steady itself, not because everything suddenly went right, but because my attention was no longer split. I stopped carrying conversations I never had into meetings that did not need them. Brian gave me more responsibility without comment. Trust returned the same way it often does in real life, gradually, without applause. Jenna did not bring Tyler up again. His absence was not dramatic, but it was real. It showed up in the empty space where certain conversations used to land, in the way Jenna hesitated before sharing stories that belonged to a past she was now seeing differently. Once I noticed her typing a message and then deleting it before setting her phone down. She did not say anything. Neither did I. One evening after Rachel had gone to bed, Jenna sat across from me at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that invites honesty whether you are ready or not. I keep thinking about what you said she told me, about disappearing. I waited. I did not see it before she said. Or maybe I did and told myself it was fine. I told her that was the part that hurt. Not that she made a choice, but that my role in it had been assumed. She nodded slowly. There was no defense in her posture now, just fatigue. I do not know if I can undo that, she said. I told her I was not asking her to undo anything, only to see it clearly. To understand that boundaries ignored do not vanish. They turn into distance. She asked me if I was staying. The question surprised me, not because I did not have an answer, but because I realized how much it mattered now. I told her I was staying present, that I was not making promises about outcomes, only about honesty. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off. The tree still stood in the corner bare except for the white lights. I felt a flicker of sadness then, not regret. Sadness for the version of my life that had relied on me staying quiet to function. That version was gone. This was the karma, if there was such a thing. Not punishment, not revenge. Just the natural consequence of stepping back from a role that had been built on my silence. Some things grew clearer. Others grew uncertain. Both were honest. I did not gain control over anyone else. I gained control over my presence, over where I showed up and where I did not, over what I agreed to carry and what I set down. On a cold morning in January, I took Rachel to breakfast at a diner near her school. We sat by the window, steam rising from our mugs. Outside, people moved through their routines, bundled against the cold, each carrying stories no one else could see. Rachel looked up at me over her pancakes. "Are you okay now?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. I told her I was still tired sometimes. Still unsure, still learning how to live without smoothing every edge. But I was okay with that, because pretending had cost me more than discomfort ever did. She nodded and went back to her food satisfied. I do not know where my marriage will end up. I do not know if clarity will lead us closer, or simply make the distance easier to name. Real life does not offer tidy conclusions. It offers choices made again and again in ordinary moments. What I do know is this: I will never return to being the man who stays silent just to keep the peace. Not in my home, not in my work, not in front of my child. And if you have ever found yourself in a room where your comfort was treated like an obstacle, if you have ever been told that swallowing your boundary was the mature thing to do, and I want to ask you something. Where is your line? And what has it cost you to pretend it was not there?